Einstein's battles in the political sphere were only part of his commitments to a life beyond the individual. Einstein also had extremely deep feelings about religion and religiosity. He considered himself throughout his life to have a spiritual commitment, but one that never hewed to any particular doctrine. And in this conception of God, there are really two parts of the argument. First, Einstein consistently claimed to have no commitment to a personal God, that is to say, a God who resembled a person and interceded in daily life to exact revenge or support or reward. And then there's a God that represents a cosmic order, a rational structure to the universe that we are capable of grasping, even if only in bits. The importance of these views is that Einstein truly believed that it was impossible to devote your life to the uncovering of the order of nature without believing that that order was there. And he called that order of nature, that widespread principle of graspable rationality, God. To Edgar Meyer on the 2nd of January 1915, Einstein wrote, "Why do you write to me, God should punish the English?" This is in the midst of World War I. "I have no close connection to either one or the other, the English or God. I see only with deep regret that God punishes so many of his children for their numerous stupidities, for which he himself can be held responsible. In my opinion, only his non-existence could excuse him." Or a few years later, in 1923, Einstein wrote, "I can look at doctrinaire traditions in religion only with a historical and psychological perspective. I have no other connection with them." 1927, "I cannot conceive of a personal God who would directly influence the actions of individuals. My religiosity consists of a humble admiration of the infinitely superior spirit that reveals itself in the little that we can comprehend of the knowable world." That deeply emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power, which is revealed in the incomprehensible universe, forms my idea of God. In something that almost seems quaint now, a Jewish newspaper asked Einstein for his views of God, and Einstein telegraphed back the response in 1929. He said, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists, but not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and actions of human beings." Now, Baruch Spinoza, was a philosopher in the 17th century who began as a Cartesian, believing that there were two kinds of orders in the world, the order of mind and the order of matter. But Spinoza came to believe that there was really only one entity in the world, one continuous entity. And sometimes Spinoza's beliefs are called pantheistic because he saw God in the order of all things. And that we, Spinoza thought, would understand our position in the world as determined in a lot of ways by thinking, by rationalizing, by coming to an understanding of our situation, not because we had some radical idea of free will. Well, this really offended many of the Jewish and Christian authorities, and for centuries, both groups came down hard on Spinoza, and it became a tradition to argue against Spinoza. But for other philosophers, especially in the 20th century, Spinoza's views came to be quite inspirational. So Einstein saw in Spinoza somebody whose understanding of a rational, determined structure of the world, of a God everywhere in the order of things, as something that was enormously appealing. His essay, What I Believe, which was published in 1930, has Einstein arguing along just these lines. I cannot conceive of a God who rewards and punishes his creatures, or has a will of the kind that we experience in ourselves. Neither can I, nor would I, want to conceive of an individual who survives his physical death. Let feeble souls, from fear or absurd egoism, cherish such thoughts. Einstein nonetheless believed that to be a scientist, to commit oneself heart and soul to understanding the order of the world, required a certain kind of faith. In 1934, he said, "You will hardly find one among the profounder sort of scientific minds without a religious feeling of his own. But it is different from the religiosity of the naive man. For the latter, God is a being from whose care one hopes to benefit and whose punishment one fears, a sublimation of a feeling similar to that of a child for its father." So Einstein believed that one had to leave aside a God that resembled us or resembled the father of a family, but rather was of a different order. And it's to that we now turn, to the God of a cosmic order. Einstein's view about religion was not just negative. It was not simply a criticism of a too anthropomorphic, a too human-based picture of what God was like, rewarding and punishing us as if a person. Instead, Einstein had a positive view of what God was like, of this spirituality of rationality that pervaded all the world. In every true searcher of nature, Einstein wrote, there is a kind of religious reverence, for he finds it impossible to imagine that he is the first to have thought out the exceedingly delicate threads that connect his perceptions. This idea comes back over and over again in Einstein. He constantly is asking what it is about the creation of the world, about the order that underlies all things, that we can grasp. I want to know, Einstein said in 1920 to a student, how God created this world. I am not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know God's thoughts. The rest are details. And this is really the important point. Einstein felt that a belief in an order of things was the real possibility, the condition of possibility for us to be scientists at all, for us to be rational beings at all. That we're always trying to grasp the connections between our perceptions. That's what science is in the end. And that if you don't have some kind of faith that there is an ordered connection between our perceptions, why would you continue this venture? Why would you devote the bulk of your emotional and working life to understanding an order that wasn't there? In 1923, Einstein said, "My comprehension of God comes from the deeply felt conviction of a superior intelligence that reveals itself in the knowable world. In common terms, when one can describe it as pantheistic, Spinoza." Again, this reference to a Spinozistic faith in a continuum of all things that was lodged in a unified order. In discussion with an Indian mystic and poet, musician, on the 14th of July, 1930, Einstein said, "I cannot prove scientifically that truth must be conceived as a truth that is valid independent of humanity, but I firmly believe it. If there is a reality independent of man, there is also a truth relative to this reality. The problem begins with whether truth is independent of our consciousness. For instance, if nobody is in this house, that table remains where it is." Now here you see in this comment in 1930, Einstein's deep concern with the quantum world, where Bohr, and in fact the whole quantum generation, was saying that in fact it matters to reality whether we're making a measurement or not. And that really offended Einstein at a very deep level. He wanted to locate a reality outside us, something independent of our actions, decisions, or hopes or desires. In his writing on cosmic religion in 1931, the next year, Einstein said, "It is very difficult to elucidate this cosmic religious feeling to anyone who is entirely without it. The religious geniuses of all ages have been distinguished by this kind of religious feeling, which knows no dogma and no God conceived in man's image, so that there can be no church whose central teachings are based on it. In my view, it is the most important function of art and science to awaken this feeling and keep it alive in those who are receptive to it." This cosmic imagination was what underlay for Einstein music and art, physics, chemistry, the world of understanding and grasping of things outside us. And if you didn't have that faith, why would you do it? "I see a pattern," Einstein continued in his piece, Cosmic Religion, "but my imagination cannot picture the maker of that pattern. I see a clock, but I cannot envision the clockmaker. The human mind is unable to conceive of the four dimensions. So how can it conceive of a God before whom 1,000 years and 1,000 dimensions are as one?" Einstein continued to be pressed by journalists, by theologians, by ordinary people, by colleagues for his views on the relationship of religion to science, on his faith, and whether one could have faith in the world of scientific developments. The New York Times Magazine published a piece in November of 1930 in which Einstein is quoted as saying this: "The man who is thoroughly convinced of the universal operation of the law of causation cannot for a moment entertain the idea of a being who interferes in the course of events. He has no use for the religion of fear and equally little use for social or moral religion. A God who rewards and punishes is inconceivable to him for the simple reason that a man's actions are determined by necessity, external and internal, so that in God's eyes he cannot be responsible any more than an inanimate object is responsible for the motions it undergoes." This is a very Spinozistic idea, that we are, in some sense, determined by the world around us, and that our goal is to become conscious of ourselves, to understand rationally the conditions of our embedding in the world, both morally and physically. Again, in that same piece in the New York Times, Einstein continued, "A man's ethical behavior should be based effectively on sympathy, education, and social relationships. No religious basis is necessary. Man would indeed be in a poor way if he had to be restrained by fear of punishment and hope of reward after death." Einstein continued to come back to these themes. And in fact, in some ways, they intensified as the struggles, pain, and violence of World War II echoed in his inner being in the years after that war. But already in 1936, a student asked him if scientists pray. Everyone, Einstein replied, who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man. In this way, the pursuit of science leads to a religious feeling of a special sort, which is indeed quite different from the religiosity of someone more naive. All of these commitments, these different ways of phrasing Einstein's sense that there was a cosmic order and that it was graspable by us. In some ways, it's an Enlightenment picture of the world, that we are, in our very being, in a position to understand some small piece of the world around us. To an anti-Nazi diplomat, Hubertus zu Löwenstein, in 1941, Einstein wrote, "In view of such harmony in the cosmos, which I, with my limited human mind, am able to recognize, there are yet people who say there is no God. But what makes me really angry is that they quote me for support of such views. Einstein believed this before World War II and after. But as he tries to understand religiosity after the war, in some ways it becomes even more deeply embedded in his commitments. Solovin, one of the members of Einstein's Olympia Academy back in Bern at the time of the patent office, and Einstein exchanged letters. And at the beginning of the year, 1951, Einstein wrote to Solovin, "I have found no better expression than religious for confidence in the rational nature of reality, insofar as it is accessible to human reason. Whenever this feeling is absent, science degenerates into uninspired empiricism." You see, Einstein believed that if you didn't have faith that this order was really there to be grasped, if all we had was certain regularities to be discovered about this or that phenomenon or this or that spectrum, if you didn't believe that there was simplicity and symmetry, the basic structure of the world could actually be compactly understood by us, that science itself would become pointless. Close to the end of Einstein's life, 1954 or 55, he wrote, "I have never imputed to nature a purpose or a goal, or anything that could be understood as anthropomorphic, as based on our own human desires. What I see in nature is a magnificent structure that we can comprehend only very imperfectly, and that must fill a thinking person with a feeling of humility. This is a genuinely religious feeling that has nothing to do with mysticism." In fact, when it comes down to it, when Einstein boils down his faith, his motivation for understanding science at all, he puts it in capsule form this way: "What really interests me is whether God could have created the world any differently. In other words, whether the demand for logical simplicity leaves any freedom at all." This is Einstein trying to understand this broad notion of religiosity, of a principle of order lodged in the world that he over and over again insists is the scientist's form of devotion, of prayer, of commitment to the world around him. But whether it's in politics or his thoughts on religion, Einstein is constantly trying to get outside the personal, to get away from the particularity, the subgroups, the religious, the national divisions that occur among people. And it saturates the science too. His attempt to find a reality independent of us is the driving force behind so many aspects of Einstein's life. And it's to that encompassing vision of the more than personal that we'll turn in the concluding discussion of the next lesson.